Welcome to The Useless Hour. Tonight, we consider a sheet of trapped air, something that has never altered the course of a single human life, and we are going to take our time about it. There is, somewhere in your home at this moment, a length of clear plastic film with small domes of air sealed into it. It arrived wrapped around something else. It was not the thing you ordered, it was the thing came in, and you almost certainly threw it away, or folded it into a drawer against some future need that has not yet arrived. It has no history that you have ever thought about. It seems like weather or gravel to have simply always been there. It has not always been there. It has a birthday, and a birthplace, and two fathers, and it was born for an entirely different purpose than the one it now serves. Tonight, we begin at the beginning, in a small garage in northern New Jersey, in the year 1957. The town is Hawthorne, a borough in Passaic County, just north of Paterson, an unremarkable stretch of the American Northeast. Mills and machine shops and modest houses, the kind of place where things are made rather than admired. On one side of a street stood a machine works called the Fielding Machine Company. On the other stood a garage. It is in that garage, according to the family's own account, that the two men did their work. Not a laboratory, not a research campus, a garage across the road from the family firm, which is where a very great many of the 20th century's objects were actually invented, whatever the corporate literature says afterwards. The first man was Alfred W. Fielding. He was a mechanical engineer, American, born in 1917. He had taken his bachelor's degree at the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken in 1939, and his master's from the same institution in 1943. And he would later teach engineering there himself and be given an honorary doctorate by it decades on, long after any of this mattered. He was, by every account that survives, a machines man, a man who thought about rollers and dies and heat and pressure, about how a thing might be made continuously rather than one at a time, which is the difference between a curiosity and an industry. If you wanted a process built, Fielding was the man who could build the thing that did it. The second man was Marc Chavannes. He was Swiss and had come to the United States and is described in the surviving accounts as a chemical engineer, though the sources are not perfectly consistent on the exact shape of his training, and we will not pretend to more precision than the record allows. What is documented is that he had been thinking about plastic film for a long time, that his interest in the embossing of thermoplastic film, the pressing of shapes and textures into sheets of warm plastic, went back to 1948. 9 years, then, of turning over the same quiet question. What could you make if you could make plastic hold shape? How exactly the two men found one another is not well recorded, and it would be easy to invent something here, and we will not. What the accounts agree on is the direction of the approach. Chavannes came to Fielding with an idea. He had the concept, Fielding had the machines and the hands. The idea was this, that you might seal two sheets of plastic together over a paper backing, and produce a wall covering that was not flat. Consider for a moment why that sounded like money. 1957 in America was a moment of enormous domestic appetite. The post-war housing boom had thrown up subdivisions at a pace the country had never seen. Millions of newly built rooms stood waiting to be decorated by people who had not previously owned rooms of their own to decorate. Wallpaper was not, then, a fusty inheritance from a grandmother's parlor. It was a live consumer market, a fashion business, and an unusually competitive one. Manufacturers were reaching hard for novelty, for surfaces with grain and nap and depth, for grass cloth and flock, and the new plastic-coated papers that promised you could wipe them clean. Texture was where the interest was. Texture was what a house-proud family in a new brand development might pay a premium for. So the proposition was not absurd. It was in fact rather good. A wall covering with 3 dimensions to it, with actual raised air held under a clear skin, casting the lamplight, casting its own small shadows, warm to the palm, insulating in some modest way against the cold of an exterior wall. Not printed to look like texture, actually textured. A wall you could press your hand into and feel give slightly, and then push back. The execution, when it came, was almost aggressively humble. They took 2 shower curtains. They ran them together through a heat sealing machine, fusing the sheets to one another, and the air that could not escape between them was caught and formed itself into pockets.
That is the invention. Not a stage on the way to it, not a prototype of it. That is the thing itself. 2 shower curtains and a heat sealer, in a rented garage, in a New Jersey borough, on a day nobody thought to write down. They looked at what had come out. It was not what they had drawn. The bubbles were irregular, arriving where the ceiling had happened to permit them, rather than where a designer would have placed them. But there was something there, and both men could see it, and Fielding set about the harder problem, which was making the accident repeatable, developing machines that could vacuum form a proper ordered pattern of bubbles between 2 sheets of treated plastic, in a grid, on demand, forever. That is the part that took the engineering. Anyone can trap air once. Trapping it in rows, identically, at the speed of a moving web of film, is a career. And having done that, they took it to market, and offered the world a wall that breathed. The world declined. You do not need to remember any of this, but it is worth dwelling on the particular flavor of that refusal, because it was not dramatic. Nobody denounced the product. There was no scandal, no ruinous lawsuit, no rival who crushed them. The idea was simply carried to the people who buy such things, the decorators, the interior designers, the ones who might have been adventurous enough to hang plastic bubbles in a living room, and those people looked at it and did not want it. The record does not preserve a single furious litter. It preserves an absence. No orders of any consequence, no line of eager buyers, no fortune. It is a specific kind of disappointment, that one. Not failure by catastrophe, but failure by shrug. The 2 men had a product that worked exactly as designed. It sealed. It held its air. It was, by the engineering standards of the day, an achievement. And it turned out that the thing they had proved was that you could make 3-dimensional wallpaper, and the thing the market had to say in reply was that nobody had ever wanted 3-dimensional wallpaper, and that the reason it did not already exist was not that it was difficult. Somewhere in Hawthorne, then, in the closing months of the 1950s, there sat rolls of a beautiful and useless material in a garage across from a machine shop belonging to 2 engineers who had solved the wrong problem with real distinction. They did not throw it away. They did not go back to their previous lives. They began instead to ask a different question. Not, how do we make this, which was answered, but what on earth is this for? And they would go on asking it patiently and unsuccessfully for some time yet. We will come to their second answer shortly. It was greenhouses. It was also wrong. The failure of the wallpaper did not, it seems, dislodge the conviction that the material was good for something. This is a particular kind of faith, and it is worth pausing on because it is the engine of everything that follows.
Fielding and Chavannes did not conclude that they had made a mistake. They concluded that they had made a product, and that somewhere out in the American economy there existed a customer who had not yet been correctly identified. So they looked at the sheets again, 2 layers of plastic film, air trapped between them in an orderly grid of small domes, and they asked what else a wall of captured air might be for. And the answer they arrived at was greenhouse insulation. It is important to say that this was not a foolish idea. It was, in fact, thermally sound, and it remains thermally sound today. Air is a very poor conductor of heat. The difficulty with using air as insulation is that air will not stay still. Warmed at one surface and cooled at another, it begins to circulate, carrying heat across the gap by convection and undoing the benefit. The trick in every insulating material that has ever worked is to divide the air into compartments small enough that it cannot get up any meaningful motion. That is what loft insulation does with tangled fiber. That is what a double-glazed window does with a sealed cavity. And that is precisely what a sheet of small sealed bubbles does, at a scale of a few millimeters, hundreds of times per square foot. Fielding and Chavannes had, without especially meaning to, manufactured a flexible, rollable, translucent wall of stationary air. For a greenhouse, this had a second virtue, which is that light still passes through it. An insulating material that blocks the sun is of no use whatsoever to a tomato. The bubbles diffuse the light rather than blocking it, and a diffused light is not necessarily a worse light for a plant. On paper, then, the proposition was excellent. A transparent insulator, cheap to manufacture, light enough to be fixed to glazing bars by one person on a stepladder, and capable of holding a few degrees of warmth inside a glasshouse through a cold night in February. You could construct a very persuasive sales document from those facts. It appears that somebody did. The greenhouse market declined it anyway. The reasons were commercial rather than physical, which is the most frustrating category of reason there is. Growers already had ways of keeping a glasshouse warm, and those ways were established, cheaper by the square foot, and understood by the men who installed them. A commercial grower operating on the margins of horticulture does not adopt an unfamiliar plastic on the strength of a diagram about convection. He waits to see whether his neighbor's crop survives the winter. The material was competing not against ignorance, but against incumbency, and incumbency generally wins. So the second application failed as thoroughly as the first, and for entirely different reasons. The wallpaper failed because nobody wanted it, and the insulation failed because everybody already had something like it. There is a small and rather melancholy postscript here, which is that the idea was correct all along. Walk into any garden centre in Britain in October, and you will find rolls of horticultural bubble insulation sold for exactly this purpose, by the metre, with the bubbles somewhat larger and the film treated for life in sunlight. Amateur gardeners line their greenhouses with it every autumn and take it down every spring. The market that Fielding and Chavannes could not find in the early 1960s did eventually assemble itself. It simply did so decades later and made them no money at all. You do not need to remember any of this. It will not help you. And so we come to the part of the story that matters, and it begins not in a laboratory, but with a man reading a newspaper. On the 5th of October 1959, IBM announced the 1401. It is difficult now to convey how significant this machine was. It was a transistorized, stored program computer aimed not at defense laboratories or universities, but at ordinary businesses, insurance offices, utilities, railways, payroll departments. And it was priced and configured so that such organizations could actually have one. The response was extraordinary. IBM took thousands of orders within weeks, more in the first month or so than the company had forecast for the machine's entire commercial life, and by the middle of the decade, the 1401 family accounted for something close to half the computer systems in the world. Whatever else it was a phenomenon. It was also a logistical problem of a sort that had not previously existed at scale. Every one of those machines had to be physically transported from a factory to a customer's premises over American roads and railways and arrive functioning. The 1401 was not a delicate object in the sense that a wine glass is delicate. It was heavy, it was cased in steel, and it was engineered to be moved. But inside those cabinets were circuit boards, connectors, relays, printer mechanisms, and read-write heads, all of them assembled to tolerances that did not appreciate being dropped, and the units and peripherals that accompanied a system were shipped in a fleet of crates rather than one. A machine that arrived intact but out of alignment was, for practical purposes, an extremely expensive filing cabinet, and IBM's engineers would have to be sent to it. Frederick W. Bowers was a marketing man at the company Fielding and Chavannes had founded in 1960, by then called Sealed Air, selling the bubble material under the trade name AirCap. Bowers read about the 1401's commercial introduction, and what he understood, the accounts of exactly when and in what form he made his approach differ somewhat, and it is not worth pretending to a precision the record does not support, was that the problem IBM now faced was not a problem of walls or of glass houses, it was a problem of motion. The whole quality that had made the material useless as decor, its refusal to lie flat and behave, its insistence on being three-dimensional and springy and full of air, was exactly the quality required by an object traveling 400 miles on a lorry bed. Every bubble is a tiny sealed pneumatic cushion. Struck, it deforms, absorbs the energy of the blow, and gives it back slowly. A sheet of them turns a sharp shock into a gentle one. Bowers took this to IBM, and the case was made, and it was accepted. The particulars of that meeting are company law, told the same way for 60 years, and resting on no document anyone can now produce, so we will leave them where they are. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The material was adopted by shipping the 1401. And once it had been adopted by IBM, a company whose procurement decisions the rest of American industry watched with close attention, the question of what the stuff was for was permanently settled. Within a few years, it was not a product, but an assumption. Consider gravely what actually happened here. The material never changed. Not the chemistry, not the geometry, not the manufacturing process in any fundamental way. The identical sheet that failed on a wall and failed in a glass house succeeded in a crate. What changed was solely the question being asked of it. Fielding and Chavannes had spent years asking what their invention looked like and what it kept warm, when the correct question, the only question that would have ever worked, was what it did when you hit it. Two men had built a superb answer and then, twice in succession, presented it to the wrong question with complete sincerity. There is a temptation to call this luck. It is more accurate to call it a failure of imagination that happened to be survivable. Most inventions that are misunderstood by their own inventors simply disappear because the money runs out before the third guess. This one survived long enough to be understood by a third party who had no emotional investment in the first two guesses at all, and who was therefore free to look at a sheet of trapped air and see, instead of a wall, a collision. None of this will ever be useful to you, but the object was, in the end, exactly what it had always been. It was only ever the people who were wrong. The machine that makes it begins, as most quiet industrial miracles do, with pellets. Polyethylene arrives at the factory as small translucent beads, poured into a hopper and fed into a long, heated barrel with a single turning screw inside it. The screw does two things at once. It moves the resin forward, and by sheer friction and the heat of the barrel, it melts that resin into a thick, slow, honey-like liquid. At the far end of the barrel, the melt is pushed through a flat die, a narrow slot the full width of the machine, and what emerges is a clear film, warm and soft and entirely featureless. Nothing about it yet suggests what it is going to become. It is simply plastic, thin enough to see through, moving forward at the pace the line demands. Two such sheets are needed. One of them will become the bubbles, the other will become the lid. The first sheet is carried to the forming drum, and the forming drum is where the actual invention lives. It is a large metal cylinder, machined with great care, and its surface is covered in cavities, small, shallow, evenly spaced, each one drilled or cut to a specified diameter and depth, laid out in a grid that runs the entire width and circumference of the roll. Beneath those cavities is a vacuum system. As the warm film wraps onto the drum, the vacuum pulls, and the film, still soft enough to stretch, but no longer liquid, is drawn down into every cavity at once. It thins as it stretches. It takes the shape of the space it has been given. Where a moment ago there was a flat sheet, there is now a field of identical domes, hundreds of them across the width of the web, thousands of them a minute, each one a faithful negative copy of a hole in a piece of turned steel. There is a particular reverence owed to that drum. Every bubble that will ever be popped in an office, in a stockroom, on a kitchen floor by a child who has been told to stop, was shaped by a hole in a cylinder that some engineer specified to a tolerance and some machinist cut. The uniformity you feel under your thumb is the uniformity of that tooling, reproduced without variation for the working life of the roll. Then comes the sealing, and the sealing is the part people rarely consider. While the domed sheet is still on the drum and still warm, the second flat film is brought against it under heat and pressure, and the two layers weld together across the flat land that surrounds every bubble. The air that happened to be sitting in each cavity when the lid arrived is now inside and has nowhere to go. The web then passes over chilled rollers, which drop the temperature and set the shape, and the material is wound onto large rolls at the end of the line, finished, having been a bag of pellets a few minutes earlier. What that lamination produces is worth stating plainly. It is not one air cushion. It is a very large number of extremely small, entirely independent sealed vessels, each one bounded on all sides and connected to none of its neighbors. Puncture one, and you have lost one. The sheet does not deflate the way an air mattress deflates. It loses a single bubble and continues, at very slightly reduced capacity, to do its job. That property has a name in engineering, and the name is graceful degradation, and bubble wrap possesses it by accident of geometry. The cushioning itself is not really done by the plastic. The plastic is only the container. The work is done by the air. And the reason air works is that a sealed pocket of gas behaves as a spring. Press on a bubble and you reduce its volume, and reducing the volume of a fixed quantity of gas raises its pressure, and the rising pressure pushes back harder the further you go. This is the relationship Robert Boyle described in the 17th century, and it is the entire mechanism of the thing. The bubble slows the impact rather than stopping it, spreading the arrival of the energy over a longer distance and a longer moment, which is precisely what the corner of a picture frame requires. When the load is removed, the air expands again and the bubble returns. It is a spring that never fatigues, housed in a wall that eventually does. You do not need to hold on to any of this. It will be equally true in the morning. Which raises the question of the years. A roll of bubble wrap left in a cupboard is still inflated a very long time later, and the reason is a slow and rather beautiful piece of physics called permeation. Gas does not need a hole to leave. Molecules of oxygen and nitrogen dissolve into the surface of the polyethylene, work their way through the disordered regions between the polymer chains, and emerge on the far side, one molecule at a time, without anything ever tearing. Oxygen moves through polyethylene somewhat faster than nitrogen does, because the oxygen molecule presents a slightly smaller cross-section to the gaps it has to squeeze through. So the air inside an old bubble is not quite the air that was sealed in, and the difference is measurable, and no one has ever noticed it while popping one. The rate is very slow, partly because the pressure inside a bubble is close to the pressure outside it, and gas is driven through a film by differences rather than by amounts. What actually flattens bubble wrap in practice is less romantic. Sustained compression at the bottom of a warehouse stack, warmth and time will press air out through the film faster than a shelf in a cupboard ever will, which is why the industry treats air retention as a specification rather than an assumption. For the cases where retention genuinely matters, there is barrier bubble. Rather than a simple polyethylene wall, the film is co-extruded with an additional layer sandwiched in the middle, commonly nylon, which the gas molecules find far harder to cross. The bubble is then, in effect, a small pressure vessel with a liner. This is the material specified for heavy or fragile goods with long shipping and storage cycles, where a cushion has to still be a cushion after months in a container rather than after a week in a van. The diameter of the bubble is likewise a decision, not a default. The common small format, around 3/16 of an inch, gives a dense field of many small contact points and is chosen for surface protection, scratches, chips, scuffs on glassware, frames, phones and plated fittings. The medium format, around 5/16, holds more air per bubble and absorbs more energy while still wrapping reasonably closely around an awkward shape. The large, half-inch bubble holds the most air and travels the furthest before it bottoms out, which makes it the choice for real impact and for filling the empty volume in a crate so that nothing inside can gather speed. The trade is always the same one. A larger bubble gives you a longer, softer stroke and a coarser fit. A smaller bubble hugs the object and runs out of travel sooner. Somewhere in a technical office, someone has selected between these for the thing that arrived at your door.
And inside all of it, in every size and every grade, is ordinary air. The same air that was in the factory on the day the sheet was made, sealed in because it happened to be standing in the cavity at the moment the lid came down. There is no special gas. There is no manufacturing secret. The persistent belief that bubble wrap contains something else, something engineered, occasionally something dangerous, is a piece of folklore with no identifiable origin,
And it survives because sealed things invite suspicion, and because a pop is a small, pressurized event, and pressurized events feel like they ought to involve something more interesting than the atmosphere of a room in New Jersey. It is air. It was always air. It is holding a lamp steady in a box somewhere as you listen to this. The corporation itself arrived 3 years after the accident that produced it, which is a reasonable interval for two men to spend deciding whether they had a business or merely a curiosity. Sealed Air Corporation was incorporated in 1960 in New Jersey by Alfred W. Fielding, a mechanical engineer, and Marc A. Chavannes, a Swiss chemical engineer, and it began life on roughly $85,000, raised through a small public stock offering. That is the entire founding capital of the company that would go on to wrap the world. The product was not called bubble wrap at first. It was sold as air cap, a name chosen because it described what the material was rather than what it did, and because in 1960 nobody had yet discovered that the honest description of a thing is almost never the name that survives. For most of the first decade, the company was very small and very specialized, which is the ordinary condition of a firm that has invented something for which the world has not yet developed an appetite. By the end of the 1960s, annual sales had reached something in the region of $4 million, which sounds modest until you understand that this represented very nearly the whole of the market for the product, because the market for the product was the product. Sealed Air was not competing for a slice of an existing industry. It was slowly persuading an industry to exist. In 1971, the company took on a chief executive named T.J. Dermot Dunphy, who had come to its board after selling a packaging firm of his own, and who would run Sealed Air for the better part of 30 years. Under him, the numbers do the thing that numbers occasionally do in corporate histories, which is to stop crawling and start climbing. Sales passed $10 million in the early 70s. By the late 80s, they stood in the hundreds of millions. They crossed $500 million for the first time in the mid-1990s, and the company had spent 2 decades acquiring other packaging businesses, foam systems, protective mailers, industrial films, so that the bubbles were no longer the whole of it, or even most of it. Then, in March 1998, came the transaction that changed what kind of company it was. Sealed Air combined with the cryovac food packaging business of W.R. Grace & Company in a stock and cash arrangement valued at something near $5 billion. Overnight, the maker of the cushioning material became one of the largest packaging companies on Earth, and also, as it turned out, the inheritor of a legal problem it had not made. Grace's long history of asbestos liability followed the deal, and Sealed Air spent years in litigation over whether the cryovac transaction had left those claims behind. It settled eventually, paying a very large sum in cash and in a substantial block of its own shares toward the trusts established for Grace's asbestos claimants. The company that had begun as 2 men and a heat-sealing machine now employed lawyers who would never see a bubble. The headquarters left New Jersey in the 2010s for Charlotte, North Carolina. By the mid-2020s, the company was reporting annual revenue in the billions of dollars, with something like 16,000 employees and operations spread across more than 200 locations worldwide. None of this will ever be useful to you. The founders did not stay to watch most of it. Fielding served as an executive vice president and a director of the company he had built, and retired in 1987. Chavannes, who had brought the original wallpaper idea to Fielding's workshop in the first place, drifted into the role of consultant, which is the polite corporate word for a founder who is still fond of the thing but no longer required to attend meetings about it. Between them they held a small handful of patents on the material. In 1993, they were inducted together into the New Jersey Inventors Hall of Fame, an honor that arrived, as such honors often do, only just in time. Both men died in the years that followed, having lived to see their failed wallpaper become a fixture of every loading dock on the planet, and having been given by the world at large almost no credit for it whatsoever. Which brings us to the strange, patient, entirely serious matter of the name.
Bubble wrap is a trademark. It is not a category, not a description, not a con noun, and not, legally speaking, a thing that exists in the world independent of its owner. It is a registered mark belonging to sealed air, and the registrations on file describe the goods in language of magnificent bloodlessness as cellular cushioning packaging material containing entrapped bubbles of air or other gases. That is the official designation. That is what it says on the paperwork. Somewhere in a filing cabinet, the most joyful object in commerce is described as entrapped bubbles of air or other gases. The mark was not easy to obtain because trademark law is suspicious of names that merely describe what a product is, and a wrap made of bubbles is very close indeed to being called bubble wrap. A descriptive name of that kind can only be registered properly once its owner can demonstrate what the law calls acquired distinctiveness, that the public has come to hear the words not as a description but as a source, a maker, a signature. The company had to prove, in other words, that when people said bubble wrap, they meant this bubble wrap. It won that argument, and then it spent the next several decades watching the very success that won it slowly begin to unwind it.
The hazard has a name, and the name is genericity. A trademark dies of genericity when the public adopts it so completely that it stops meaning a brand and starts meaning a thing. American law is explicit that this can happen, and explicit about the test. What matters is the primary significance of the mark to the relevant public, not whether the owner has been diligent, not whether the registration is current, simply what the words mean in the mouths of ordinary people. If ordinary people mean the object, the mark is gone, and the courts will cancel it. The graveyard is well populated, and every headstone was once a fortune. Aspirin belonged to Bayer until a New York court held in 1921 that the public had taken it. Escalator belonged to Otis until 1950, when the registration was cancelled in part because Otis had been caught using the word generically in its own advertising and filings, a company convicted, in effect, by its own prose. Cellophane went the same way. Thermos was declared generic in the early 1960s. Yo-yo, trampoline, dry ice, kerosene, zipper, laundromat. All of them were somebody's property once, and all of them were lost in exactly the way a language loses a word, which is by everybody using it. So the defense is grammar. This is the quiet, monkish part of the story. A trademark is defended day after day and year after year by insisting that it is an adjective and never a noun. Never bubble wrap, always bubble wrap brand cushioning. Never a roll of bubble wrap, always a roll of bubble wrap brand air cellular material. The registered symbol placed after the words every time, without exception, in every catalogue, every product page, every press release, in perpetuity. When the brand may not be used, there are the careful generic alternatives instead, inflated cushioning, or air cellular cushioning material, phrases of such determined grayness that they could only have been written by someone protecting something. Xerox once bought advertisements begging the public not to use its name as a verb. Johnson & Johnson rewrote its own jingle so that the words Band-Aid brand would scan. These are not eccentricities, they are liturgy performed by people who understand that a name is a thing you can lose by being loved too much.
And so the small, sad arithmetic of it. Everyone alive knows the words bubble wrap. Almost nobody alive knows they belong to anyone. The company's greatest asset is a phrase that its owner must constantly, gently, and without ever appearing rude, correct the whole world about. A vow renewed each morning in footnotes and style guides and letters to magazine editors against a congregation of 8 billion people who will never hear it. There is nothing to be done about it. There is only the discipline of the small raised R, kept faithfully forever in the dark. Somewhere between the loading dock and the recycling bin, the material stops being packaging and becomes something else entirely. The parcel is opened, the contents are lifted out and set aside, and the person who has just received a kettle or a lamp or a replacement part for a washing machine sits down on the floor with the wrapping instead. Nobody instructed them to do this. There is no line of small print on the sheet inviting them to begin, and yet across most of the world where the material travels, the same thing happens, in more or less the same posture, with the same slightly distant expression, and it has been happening quietly for well over half a century.
The scientific literature on this behavior is thinner than its cultural footprint would suggest. There is essentially one study that everyone cites, and it deserves to be described accurately rather than grandly. In 1992, Kathleen M. Dillon, a psychologist at Western New England College in Springfield, Massachusetts, published a short paper in the journal Psychological Reports under the title Popping Sealed Air Capsules to Reduce Stress. 30 undergraduates took part. Some were given 2 sheets of the material to pop, others were not. Afterwards, the participants rated their own moods, and those who had popped reported feeling calmer and more awake than they had beforehand, and calmer and more alert than the group that had not been given anything to pop. Dillon noted mildly that the technique required almost no ability, no training, and no practice, and carried little risk of the paradoxical anxiety that some people experience when they are told to sit still and meditate. That is the entire evidentiary foundation. 30 students at one American college rating their own feelings on a questionnaire immediately afterwards, with no physiological measurement, no long-term follow-up, and no large replication in the decades since. It is a small, honest, modest study, and it has been carried on the shoulders of headline writers for more than 30 years as though it were a body of evidence rather than a single paper of 4 pages. What it genuinely supports is narrow, that a group of young adults said they felt better after popping some plastic. What it does not support is any claim about the treatment of anxiety or blood pressure or anything measured by an instrument rather than reported by a person who has just been handed something enjoyable and then asked whether they enjoyed it. There is a second figure that circulates far more widely than the study does, and it should be handled with tongs. You may have encountered the claim that 1 minute of popping delivers stress relief equivalent to a 33-minute massage. That number does not come from an experiment.
It comes from survey work commissioned by the company that manufactures the material, promoted in connection with the celebration of the material, and a survey asking people how stressed they feel cannot, by its design, establish an exchange rate between a sheet of plastic and half an hour of massage. The figure is marketing. It is repeated in good faith by people who have no reason to check it. It is not a finding, and this program will not treat it as one.
What can be described precisely is the mechanics, because the mechanics are physics rather than psychology. Each bubble is a sealed pocket of air held between two layers of film. When a finger presses down, the air inside has nowhere to go, so the pressure rises and the film begins to stretch. Stretching thins it, thinning weakens it. For a moment, perhaps a second or two, the bubble pushes back and the finger meets a small definite resistance that increases the harder it is pressed. Then the film reaches its limit at whatever point is thinnest or most stressed, and it fails all at once. The energy that went in slowly comes out instantaneously. The air escapes through a tear of a few millimeters in a fraction of a millisecond, and that abrupt release of pressure is the sound, a sharp, broadband click with no sustain and no tail, a noise that is over before the ear has finished registering it. Resistance, threshold, collapse, report. The finger is pushing against something, and then, without any transition, it is pushing against nothing, and a sound arrives to confirm what the hand already knows. The event is complete, and the next one is a centimeter away, laid out in a grid of identical, uniform, countable units, each of which can be brought from one clear state to the other clear state by a single small action that cannot be got wrong. Explanations for why this arrangement is so agreeable are easy to construct and hard to prove, and the honest position is that we have a good description of the mechanism and a poor understanding of the appetite. The behavior sits somewhere in the wide, understudied territory of things people do with their hands while thinking about something else, alongside clicking a pen and tearing a beer label into strips, and it has attracted rather less research funding than that territory probably deserves. You do not need to remember any of this. It is not going to be useful. The compulsion has, however, acquired the two things that mark a behavior as properly established, a date and a market. The date arrived in January 2001 at a small radio station in Bloomington, Indiana, called Spirit 95, when a shipment of microphones was delivered to the studio and unwrapped while a microphone was live. The sound of the packaging being opened went out over the airwaves by accident. Listeners rang in about it. Jim Webster of the station turned the accident into an annual observance, and Bubble Wrap Appreciation Day has been marked on the last Monday of January ever since. No legislature proclaimed it, no committee ratified it. It was simply repeated until it became a fixture, adopted in time by holiday registers, by schools, by local news bulletins short of an item, and eventually by the manufacturer itself, which is the ordinary life cycle of a folk holiday compressed into about a decade. The largest formal gathering for the purpose on record took place not in January but in September. On the 19th of September 2015, at the Peaceful Valley Scout Ranch in Elbert, Colorado, 2,681 members of the Denver Area Council of the Boy Scouts of America popped bubble wrap simultaneously at their annual camporee, and Guinness World Records recognized the total. 2,500 people in a field in Colorado, all pressing at once. The market arrived from Japan. In 2007,
Bandai released a keychain called Mugen Puchi Puchi, which translates roughly as Infinite Pop Pop. A small plastic square carrying 8 buttons of double-layered silicone rubber that click when pressed and then reset so that the supply never runs out. Because an endless bubble is in one sense a broken bubble, the designers added a small subversion. Roughly once in every 100 presses, instead of the click, the toy emits something else, a door chime, a barking dog, and 1 or 2 less dignified alternatives, so that the repetition contains a lottery. It was reported to have sold more than 2 million units by the middle of 2008. A version for the Nintendo Wii followed that June, and Bandai extended the line into an entire catalogue of simulated small satisfactions, a toy that reproduces the snap of a chocolate bar, one that imitates the pull tab of a can, one built around the tear strip of a cardboard box, one that pops edamame. The keychain was sold in Europe and North America as Mugen Pop Pop, which leaves the strangest part of the whole business, and the part an anthropologist would circle. Nobody was taught this. There is no ceremony, no elder, no transmitted instruction, no origin story that anyone tells. A sheet of protective film arrives in a house. The person who opens the parcel discovers within seconds what the sheet does, and the discovery is complete and requires no repetition. It happens to children who have never seen an adult do it, and to adults who cannot remember the first time they did it themselves. It is one of the very few behaviors shared across most of the industrialized world that has no folklore attached to it whatsoever, because it does not need any. The object explains itself once to each pair of hands that finds it, and then the hands take over, and the person sits on the floor a little longer than they meant to, working steadily across a grid, thinking about nothing at all. The news, when it came, arrived in the ordinary way that trade news arrives, which is to say, quietly, in a business newspaper, on a summer morning in 2015. Sealed Air had developed a new form of bubble cushioning, and the Wall Street Journal reported it in the first days of July. The product was called iBubble Wrap, and later, when it reached the wider market, Bubble Wrap IB. It was, by every measure a packaging engineer would recognize as a measure, an improvement, and it did not pop. The reasoning behind it was entirely and unglamorously logistical. Conventional bubble cushioning is, by weight, almost nothing, and by volume enormous. A warehouse that buys it is buying air, and paying to have that air driven across a country in a lorry, and paying again to store that air on a shelf until a parcel needs it. The company's own figures, published when the product went worldwide in March of 2016, put the savings starkly. 1 lorry load of the uninflated material, unloaded in about 2 hours of labor, was the equivalent of roughly 36 lorry loads of ordinary bubble cushioning and some 72 hours of work. The trucks required to supply a customer's operation could fall by nearly 97%. To make this work, the bubbles had to change shape. In the classic material, each bubble is its own sealed pocket, an individual island of trapped air, and this is precisely why it pops. Squeeze it, and the air inside has nowhere at all to go except through the wall of its own cell. In the new design, the bubbles were linked in chains, connected along channels, so that air could travel between them. Press 1, and the air simply moves next door. The cushioning still cushions, and the connected structure meant a punctured bubble no longer meant a dead one. But the pop, the small percussive event that had been an accidental gift of the manufacturing process since the late 50s, was engineered out. Not maliciously, not even deliberately in the sense of anyone setting out to remove it. It was simply the cost of a better channel geometry, and geometry does not care what anybody enjoys.
The public reaction was not what a packaging announcement usually receives, which is nothing. Within days, the story had been picked up by technology magazines and design journals and evening news programs, and the language they reached for was not the language of commerce. Headlines announced the death of the pop. One outlet ran it as a rest in peace. Another framed it as a crisis. A third concluded with the particular guilt of a species that has just been told its fun is expensive, that this was all our fault. Nobody had lost anything of consequence. The parcels would still arrive intact, the plates would still be whole, and yet a great many adults on several continents spend part of a July week processing what can only honestly be described as a small bereavement. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it is the strangest thing in this entire story. A firm made a decision about lorries, purely about lorries, about cubic meters and diesel, and the labor hours involved in unloading a trailer full of air, and the world received that decision as a death in the family. Somewhere between the factory in New Jersey and the kitchen table where a parcel gets opened, a freight efficiency calculation had turned into a matter of feeling. No one at Sealed Air had ever promised the public a pop. It was never on the specification sheet. It was never advertised, never costed, never listed among the material's protective properties. It was simply there for 60 years, free. And the discovery that it could be taken away was the first time most people noticed they had been receiving it. The classic material did not, in fact, disappear. It is still made, still sold, still wrapped around fragile things in enormous quantities. What arrived was not a replacement, but an alternative, aimed squarely at the high-volume warehouse where the pop had never been the point. But the larger current running underneath all of this was already turning, and it was not about popping at all. It was about what happens to a thin sheet of polyethylene after the parcel is open. Plastic film is, in the narrow sense, a triumph of efficiency. A few grams of it protect a kilogram of glass, and it weighs almost nothing on the lorry. It is also one of the hardest things in the household waste stream to recover. In most places, it cannot go in the curbside bin at all, and at the sorting facility it does real harm, wrapping itself around the spinning shafts of the machinery that separates everything else. So, a material that is superb at its job for 1 week becomes a nuisance for a very long time afterwards. The response across the industry has been a steady drift back towards paper. Crumpled kraft, honeycomb-cut sheets, molded pulp, corrugated inserts. Amazon announced in the summer of 2024 that it had replaced 95% of its plastic air pillows in its North American packaging with paper filler made from recycled content. By the company's own account, some 15 billion air pillows a year, and said later that autumn that it had met its goal of removing them entirely from that region. These are the company's own figures, and worth holding as such, but the direction is not really in dispute. Paper is heavier and bulkier and takes more energy to move, and the arithmetic between the two materials is genuinely close and genuinely contested. What paper has, decisively, is that an ordinary person can put it in an ordinary bin without thinking, and a material that gets recycled in practice will usually beat a material that is recyclable in theory. And all of this is happening as the world ships more parcels than it has ever shipped, well over 100 billion a year across the major markets alone, each one containing something that must not break. Bubble cushioning has not vanished from that world. It has simply stopped being the obvious default and become one option among many,
chosen deliberately rather than automatically, which returns us at the end to a room in Hawthorne, New Jersey in 1957, and two men with a heat sealing machine and a bad idea. Alfred Fielding and Marc Chavannes were not trying to protect anything. They were trying to make wallpaper, textured, three-dimensional modern wallpaper, the kind of thing a fashionable American living room might want. Nobody wanted it. The product failed completely, as products do, and the failure ought to have been the end of it. Instead, the material went on to wrap almost everything the 20th century made and moved: computers, artworks, medicines, telescopes, the fragile, ordinary parcels of ordinary lives. It went into homes on the outside of the box rather than on the wall, which is not where it was aimed, but is, in the end, a wider distribution than any wallpaper ever achieved. They wanted to decorate one room. They spent the next 60 years protecting everything else. And that is the whole of it. Two men, a shower curtain, a failure, and a very long afterwards. Nothing here needs anything from you. No decision waits. The bubbles are already sealed, the parcels already delivered, the wallpaper already unsold, and it has all been settled for a very long time. So let it go soft now. Let the room get quiet. Somewhere tonight, a machine is filling small pockets of air, one after another, patiently, for a parcel that will arrive safely.
Good night.